We didn't grow up knowing what executive function skills were. Life felt overwhelming. Managing time, staying organized, and feeling stuck made everything difficult. What we didn't realize was that we lacked the skills to plan, prioritize, and break goals into manageable steps. After years of trial and error, we've seen how powerful executive function skills can be. With expert interviews, real stories, and practical strategies, this podcast is the resource we wish we had. Whether you're a student, parent, or professional, we're here to help you unlock your potential. Today, we're joined by Monica Werner. Monica is a therapist and executive function coach who has a unique and blended approach. She is the co-author of Unstuck and On Target, which is a curriculum that combines evidence-based strategies to help people overcome obstacles and achieve their goals. Her insights are invaluable to parents or people struggling with executive function skills. I'm excited to share this one, and let's begin. Monica, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
So you have a curriculum that a lot of our families know, trust, they institute it, they've been through the Unstuck program. But for those people who don't know, what is Unstuck and what is your background?
So Unstuck and On Target is a cognitive behavioral intervention to support executive functions. So that's a lot of sort of big words and fancy stuff to say. It's a curriculum that we've created that can be implemented by really almost anyone that systematically teaches people how to self-advocate, set goals, make plans, make flexible plan Bs, do some emotional regulation, and check to see if their plans are working. The key areas that we target are flexibility and problem solving.
And that's what I know I really enjoy about it, is because so often when you see these executive function interventions, it's like this certain type of planner or different methodology, but you guys really focused on flexibility, which I think is awesome because that's how real life works. And I feel like that's pretty rare.
Well, I think we all have trouble being flexible, and the more difficult something is, and the more overwhelmed we are, and the more emotionally engaged we are, the harder it is to be flexible. So I think flexibility is something that we can all understand is something we struggle with. So the sort of core point is and one of the sort of, I think the secret sauce of Unstuck is to understand that this is a universal challenge, this idea that we all get stuck. And in fact, when I'm working with families and with teachers, I'm convinced that often the most rigid and stuck person in the room is not the child, it's the adult. And I think we really have to think hard about that. And what Unstuck tries to do is it doesn't demonize being stuck. Having a routine and a way of doing something can be very adaptive. It's a way to sort of make sure that your world stays organized and on track. And especially if you're neurodivergent, if you're autistic or have ADHD, you may rely very heavily on those routines to get through your day. So when one of them is messed with, it's going to be very unsettling.
Yeah, being a former special education teacher, I would always get after my kids because their desk was a mess. And then they'd look over at my desk and it was a mess, right? And so much of it is done through modeling. What is your core piece of advice for a parent or a teacher where, you said they get stuck frequently? What advice do you give to them to be able to help students?
Well, you already said it, and that's to model it in yourself. So Unstuck relies on a series of scripts or sort of key words that we then teach to. But also what you have to do is use them and model them in real life. So you, for example, will model as the adult around, today, my goal was to make a really great dinner that you kids were going to enjoy. And I really did plan to go to the grocery store, but I really messed up and I couldn't get to the grocery store. I got stuck at work and I just couldn't do it. So we're going to need to come up with a plan B, guys. Any ideas? And I think that using that kind of language is consistently starting to help people understand, and the young people in this situation understand that you solve problems by making plans and being able to make a plan B. It's really disappointing. And the operational definition of disappointment is when what you expect to happen doesn't happen, when your plan A doesn't work. And we all get a little stuck and upset about that. So model it in your own life. And frankly, nobody is having to make more plan Bs than a neurodivergent kid. And certainly the only person that might top them is the neurodivergent parent or teacher, or the teacher of the neurodivergent child.
Yeah. And what a gift to see, because I don't think growing up with ADHD, I don't think I ever saw an adult model this, but not only model it, like think out loud through the process. Like that seems like a tremendous gift.
Well, making the implicit explicit is absolutely a gift we can actually give in all parts of our life. And I always say that Unstuck isn't rocket science. A lot of this stuff that we're talking about isn't. It's just good communication and systematic way of thinking about things to make a complicated world a little easier to navigate. So this idea of narrating your world out loud, we actually all already do that. We just stop doing it at a certain point. So parents and preschool teachers narrate constantly to young children. We just stop doing that and expect somehow by magic for these things that we were explicitly teaching through narration for kids to absorb them. So the example that we give is just look at like a mom pushing their toddler in a grocery cart at the grocery store. They're talking to them constantly. Oh, look, there's the cereal. It's on sale. I bet you daddy, he loves his cereal, will be so happy when he sees that I got 2 boxes instead of 1. Think about all of the problem solving and planning you're modeling for the child by making all that stuff visible. So I'm just arguing that we should do it. We should continue the prattle, as it were, to the extent that your children can stand it. So you have to be a little judicious as they get older and not assume that they're automatically learning these processes.
Yeah, I hate the should word because the amount of times you and I hear the should word, like as kids in high school, they should be able to, they should be able to. And even if it isn't like that stream of consciousness like you would do with a toddler, like even for big decisions, you're speaking to them out loud. I think that's just such a great, easy thing that all of us can do. Do you find that parents and teachers actually improve their executive function skills as well by doing this?
I don't know if they improve their executive function skills. I think what they probably are doing is slowing down a little bit and noticing when they're getting stuck and becoming more flexible. So I've noticed it even in my own practice. When I'm doing the same thing over and over again, in other words, when I have a plan, even a really good plan, and it's not working, I will stop and say, wait a minute. What's my goal here? Because often we've made a plan for the wrong goal and we didn't even realize it. And the next thing I do is goal is one of the key words. Why? I examine why is that goal important to me? And more importantly, why would that goal be important to the child? So I think what is happening is I'm able to systematically access my executive functions in a way that I probably in the moment am not doing, especially as I'm becoming emotionally overloaded by frustration or irritation.
Yeah, it's almost like seeking clarity on your goals, which a lot of us with these challenges, we don't have that clarity. Coming back to something else that you said too, I'm always fascinated when I work with teachers with kindergarten teachers. Because kindergarten teachers seem to have all this figured out, right? Like everything that's best practice for our kids who struggle with these skills, which is a lot of kids right now, like they have visual schedules on the board. They speak directions out loud, they write them. They have clear routines. They have all these things. And then we get away from that. So besides speaking out loud, what's something else from Unstuck that comes to mind where it's something all of us can do that, really help these kids?
Well, I think you said one of them, which is talk less and write more. And so just when you're trying to make a plan, rather than just babbling at the kid and problem solving only verbally, write it down. I think the other thing that we can do is anticipate. This is something kindergarten teachers do brilliantly, which is anticipate challenges and have a plan for when the challenge is going to come. So everything from the child who melts down every time there's a substitute, you need a substitute plan then. And the first step of the substitute plan is the kid walks in, looks at the substitute and says, my plan's in the drawer, right?
Yeah,
And all that comes down to when you write things down, you slow down too.
that's good. First of all, I wish I would have had that advice as a teacher. I feel like every time I had a substitute, I had an angry email or text message coming pretty quickly from my 8th graders wrecking things. So I wish I would have had that because I love that. Anything else from Unstuck that comes to mind before I have some more general executive function questions for you?
Well, I think what is really important is Unstuck is collaborative. It's about working with somebody, not trying to force them to do things. And what it is that you starting even at a young age, but certainly by the time we're working with middle and high school students in a big way, we want them to start hearing their own voices and what their goals are and how to go about accomplishing that. they're very used to when they're dysexecutive. Often the way we've solved that problem is we've scaffolded them to within an inch of their lives. And they feel very controlled in a lot of ways. And the reason is because they are. And that's not the message we want to give kids. We want to tell them that they're effective, competent problem solvers and that we're here to help and support them.
That's great. Well, and the other thing too, and getting into the psychology term, the metacognition piece, right? The thinking about how you think. You and I both know the world is going to change a lot by the time these kids grow up and enter the workforce. That's the ultimate gift we can give them, is teaching them how they learn and how they think. And every time we jump in, we rob them of learning this. And that means they may fail a test here and there, but we can constantly dig in and ask questions like is laid out and Unstuck for, how we can improve and how we can learn upon each piece of this.
Well, I think you actually raised a very important issue here, which is at the starting point, and let me actually back up. Unstuck has something that in the high school curriculum that's about to be published called the self-advocacy formula. When we revise elementary and middle, we're going to put this in to the curriculum. So it's going to be freely available on the website, and I urge people to look at it. But the point of the way the self-advocacy formula works is that we tell children the way they get power, or people, the way you get power is first by knowing what your goal is. What are you trying to do? And it can be simple or it can be big. But the second thing is you have to know who you are. You have to understand how you learn and what it is that you're good at and what it is that's hard for you. And that allows you to either focus on what you're good at and try to stay in that domain. And let's face it, most of us as adults have stayed far away from the things we're bad at. And that's a luxury that many children don't have in school and young people don't have in school. And then the obverse is, if you know what is hard for you, you can ask for that. And you have to know what to ask for. And I think giving people that kind of tool that starts with the idea of understanding who you are, how you think, and then thinking metacognitively about how you think, that is incredibly powerful for our students.
I highly recommend checking that resource out, because I know, working with a lot of college students, that's one of the core things that we see. And when I was bombing out of college, someone said, go talk to your professor. And it was so awkward. I had no idea why I was up there. I had no idea what to advocate for. And I didn't know I could talk to the guy. Thank goodness he was patient with me, because I just didn't have the skills. And again, these are just skills, right? So I highly recommend that resource.
Yeah, there's skills that you learn when you're learning what you're advocating for, but they're extremely hard truths that you're coming to terms with when you're looking honestly at yourself about what is hard for you and what is easy. And largely that comes from the fact that we're a very judgmental world and a very judgmental society in general. And our definitions of success are often extremely narrow. And so I think that becomes very hard for kids to just honestly say, look, I'm really terrible at organizing lots of information, because that may not be met with the kind of response that they're hoping for. It may be met with the classic responses, but you're so smart. And that, every time I hear that has nothing to do with anything. So what I want us to really be thinking about is these kids have a lot of barriers within themselves to accessing the skills and the tools, because there's so much often shame and pressure to pretend that the challenges aren't there. That's why people end up bombing out instead of marching up to the professor and saying, I have a language-based learning disability and I can't do your multiple choice test.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I was even going into the emotional side, and there's a lot there. It's loaded, which is why it is so helpful to, look at this while the child is young, if you have that luxury. Right? Which brings me to one of my core questions for you is, and of course, this is highly individualized based on the student, but just some broad recommendations, like what should parents be looking at in trying to improve executive function wise in elementary school versus high school? How does that generally look?
That's really tough, because executive functions really, as you know, develop through your 20s. And the challenges are, I think you have to always just stay at the developmentally appropriate level of what you're asking a child to do. So a child who is cleaning up their toys is working on their executive functions. And so what you want to, the trap you don't want to fall into is because you're 7 and you're supposed to be able to do X thing at 7 and you're not, you're bad or lazy or obstinate. I mean, we can come up with all the pejoratives. What we want to do is step back and say, why aren't they doing it? And how do I go back and help build the skill? So I think the trick is no matter where the child is, you have to be starting where they're at. And then you have to use best practices in teaching, which is first you model and you do it right alongside them. Then you gradually start to fade back and you recognize that it's going to be a skill that if they're more tired or more stressed or whatever, more distracted, they're not going to do as well as they did the night before. And so you might have to go in and provide a little more support, but you're always working on this hierarchy towards developing a skill, building on success, and focusing on ultimately independent mastery of the skill. And you can't boil the ocean. So what I think we have to really do is you pick sort of important things and then you make the implicit explicit and you systematically go through with words what the process is. And that's how you're teaching executive functions to kids at any age.
I have so many questions about what you just said because there's so many like nuggets in there that I think are so helpful to dive into. The first one is I can see most parents listening to this and their entire, it feels like a train wreck right now. Like there seems like there's so many issues. How do we choose what are those important things to focus on without, being on our kids' tail nonstop?
That's a super important question because you know that the only time people trot out unstuck when I'm first working with the parents is when like the wheels are coming off the bus and they're careening down the highway. And I'm like, that is not the time to learn anything. That's the time to sort of get into the brace position and treat.
Yeah.
What we want to do, I think, in general, is you want to start with yourself and you want to start with modeling and using the language. Honestly, that's the starting point. Then what you want to do is just in really easy, fun things, start narrating what's going on. Hey, we want to get pizza. What should our plan be? Right? What are we going to do if they're closed? Because, I noticed there was a lot of construction in that mall the other day, and I wonder if it's impacting them. Do we have a plan B? So you want to start with just fun things where you're starting to narrate the process. Everything has a plan. You just have to sort of make it out loud. And then I think what you can start doing is empathetically identifying something that maybe is important to the kids. Most kids don't like not doing well on homework or tests. So you can say, I know it feels kind of rotten when you sit at that spelling test or you sit at that algebra test and you're struggling, you've had a plan to do it this way before. I think maybe we need a plan B, right? How can I help you?
And you were so empathetic with what you just said, and it rarely comes out like that. Like I know the researching when I'm working with kids, the frustration is hard to hold in, but you were so empathetic, not only when you model and when you looked at things through their eyes there.
There's one of the fundamental principles, and I have all these little sayings that I say to myself to also help. So not only do I have the unstuck scripts in my head, make the implicit explicit, you heard me say, but the core absolutely crux is think can't, not won't. And as soon as a kid is struggling, I think, what can't they do? What's getting in the way? And that forces you to become curious and engage with the child. I'm not guessing, I'm asking. Because I'm genuinely curious about what's getting in their way.
When it's developing those self-assessment skills, that question, I can think back to me struggling with this growing up. That question is so valuable because I have to examine, like, I don't know how much I examined. And when you start to examine, what a gift that is for someone to even ask you, like, okay, this big thing, let's say turning in a research project, you didn't do it. Where did we get stuck? Because it's coming at it as an inquisitive way versus an accusatory way.
Right. And it's a genuinely interesting issue if you really think about it. If you take the judgment out and stopping a policeman kind of, or even like a dictator and sort of go into this parental coaching, frankly, coaching is the best model of this. A good coach, when the kid isn't throwing the football the right way, doesn't yell at him and say he's inadequate, even if it's like a Big Ten school that they've been recruited to throw the football that way, right? They stop, they slow down, and they say, let's look at the fundamentals and see what's going wrong here, right?
And they're constantly inquisitive, like what you're talking about. Because I know the people who hooped and hollered at me, like they just felt like they had the answer versus, and it wasn't helpful for me. And then I get defensive, and you know the path very well, right? But when someone's inquisitive, it's whether they do or not, it feels like they actually care. And then I want to do well.
Exactly. And once you start understanding where your vulnerabilities are, what's hard for you. So we call kids procrastinators and lazy and underperforming. And really what they have is a difficulty with initiation as an executive function in the executive function domain. And so now if we say, look, getting started, initiation is really hard for you. And you're a sticky shifter, right? When you're doing one thing and you have to shift to another, it's hard for you. So let's think about how we're going to address that and not judge it. Let's just make a plan.
Yeah, it's a challenge. And how can I help? And it's 2 pats on the back, and it's 1 kick in the tail. It's love and accountability and all this stuff like you speak about. So I love that. You've mentioned the word independence 4 or 5 times now. And independence is what I feel most of my calls are about right now. Either procrastination or independence are the two. Whether it's getting your first job or going to college, we're really struggling as a society with independence right now. What are some general recommendations you have for parents who aren't quite there yet, but getting their kids ready for independence?
Well, I think the first thing you have to do is look at the word independence and what it really means. And the idea that we are independent in the kind of, American dream sense, mythology sense is ridiculous. We're all interdependent. And in fact, young people are still highly dependent, even when they're getting their first job. Like I always tell young people I'm working with, nobody was born knowing how to deal with an insurance company. Right? So we have to sort of understand that independence is a gradual thing and that actually dependence is a lifelong part of being part of society and a fully functioning person. So that's the first thing. But now to get it I get the underlying issue that you're trying to address. And I think what it is you have to use the exact same tools. What's getting in the way? In other words, if somebody is having trouble finding a job, right? What's getting in the way? That's an extraordinarily executive intensive task. It's also an extraordinarily anxiety-provoking task. So it's where somebody who has grown up with ADHD or autism or something that is impacting their executive functions, they're walking around with a heavy load on both fronts. And so they're going to need more support than their peers to do this. And that's got to be okay. Also, the last thing I say is we have to remember that development is long. I am not the same person in my 60s that I was in my 50s, 40s, or 30s. And I think we need to remember this, that in our society in general, we have extended adolescence out, right? It has gotten longer. And we can be critical of all the reasons of why that is, but we have to recognize that you're going to probably be a little more active in your child's life than you might have wanted to. And the last pin I would put in that is I would have you critically look at, is your relationship with your child the same as your relationship with your parents? And the answer generally is there is a pretty big shift in parenting approaches over the last 30 years. And so brought some good things. Our kids talk to us a lot more, and it brought some challenges. Our kids talk to us a lot more.
Yeah. Well, and first of all, thank you for normalizing that, because I'm sure you see all the stuff coming out on adulting. And well, first of all, adulting's gotten really hard. Like finding health insurance now compared to what it was 20 years ago is a very different beast. And so the amount of information coming at you is hard. And also a lot of times we get frustrated and then we step in and we solve for our students, right? And so there is that piece of it as well.
I think the whole issue of parents over-functioning for their children is a big problem, right? And I think the problem is there's this dichotomy that's been created. Like either you're stepping in and making sure you got the problem solved, or they're out there floundering and they're a failure, right? And I think the whole point of Unstuck and the whole point of understanding executive functions as a dynamic area is that you need to scaffold and structure along the way, always thinking about how you're moving towards somebody being able to do this with the most amount of autonomy possible, right?
Yeah. Well, and that's what I really liked what you said about development being long, because the other thing that where my mind goes to is the amount of parents we see trashing their relationship with their kids over math homeworks and not turning these things in middle school is wild. Like these kids are going to need you, or at least want to talk to you for a long time. And to have that big picture view and zoom out when you're frustration is really helpful.
And I think it's also, though, you can't care about something more than your children care. And you don't want to set up sort of power struggles over something that you can't make people do things. And I think if you just start with that and listen, and if I had a nickel for every time a student said to me, I'm never going to use this math again, and they're 100% right, they're never going to use this again. And I'm living proof of that. So what I want them, we need to hear it, and I'm not going to argue with them about it, and we're going to need to think about it. And I'm more than happy to have a robust discussion about the failings of the American educational system. And then we have to think about, what are we going to do about the fact that you have to take algebra to graduate high school in the United States?
Yeah. And how do we make it kind of feel relevant? They're learning how to learn, which is the ultimate gift, right? And we're learning how to do hard things, and it's probably not relevant, but what else can we do?
Here is what I try to help the kids understand about high school, is that there's two kinds of skills being taught in high school. There's the actual content, physics, history, etc. But really what you're learning are the executive function soft skills that you're going to use the rest of your life. And we often try to identify what those domains are and how those domains might be helpful to them. So they're learning things like about how to work in a group. They're learning how to break down complex tasks. They're learning how to suffer fools gladly. That's a tough one.
Yeah.
They're learning how to, sequence, organize, and advocate. And those are the executive function soft skills that I don't remember anything from high school. It was a million years ago. And yet I can specifically tell you the times that I remember learning some of these executive function skills.
When you don't know you're learning them either, things like flexibility, like what you talked about, like no one's purposely, bringing this to the forefront. Like, oh yeah, you hate this class, but we're going to teach you how to be flexible and overcome this procrastination, right? And so it does feel irrelevant, and I like your answer better than mine. So thank you. Last question I have for you before I let you go is you're one of the utmost experts in executive function in this field. What trends are you seeing recently that are different than, let's say, 10 years ago?
Well, that's really interesting. I think executive functions have become very hot. And I think we have to be careful to not fall into the trap of, if they just fill in the blank, right? They're so smart, why don't they? So I think the biggest trend that I'm seeing is an increasing acknowledgement that these things are real and are not associated with how smart somebody is. That you can be very bright and be really struggling with this, and you can't just do it, right? That's just not going to happen for them. So that we have to actually systematically address these issues. And then I think the corollary to that is, and what I spend a lot of my work doing now, is we have to sort of undo then, and this is a really positive development, is because nobody was acknowledging these things when people were young, and there was a lot of shame around it and embarrassment. The emergence of the self-advocacy movement is really important because it's bringing an awareness to people who aren't neurodivergent, to neurotypical people, but it's also bringing pride that you're not broken and you don't need to be fixed. And so that it makes it much easier for then people to access the help and support they need.
Yeah, that you're not broken, don't need to be fixed. That is so impactful. Not only saying that to someone when you experience it for the first time yourself, it's powerful because the education system gives you the exact opposite feedback.
Exactly. And I think so the emergence over the past 10 years of the self-advocacy, the autistic self-advocacy movement, which is part of the disability rights movement, which is a larger part of the civil rights movement, all of this has created a new way for us to think about neurodivergence and neurodiversity, and the importance, seeing the strengths that come with people who are out-of-the-box thinkers. You mentioned that you have ADHD, right? And that you bombed out of college. I'm guessing that that is the flip side, those challenges that you had being in college, et cetera. The flip side is what makes you so extraordinary now.
Well, thank you for saying that. And yes, it was one of the biggest gifts in my life looking back. And the hard thing for me to explain that to students is that it took me till my 30s to figure that out. But the fact that I developed that resilience and I leaned into the fact that my brain works differently. I remember being in grad school in a counseling class, working with future therapists. and they were talking about their future offices. And I'm like, my office is going to have a football field. And they're like, what are you talking about? Right. And so eventually, by that time, you have the resiliency and you have the confidence to be like, no, I think we're going to do this. And that's a gift you can only get from going through hard times, which develop confidence.
Absolutely. And the fact is, you think out of the box. All those therapists were thinking about their little chintz cushions and 2 chairs and a sofa. I mean,
Yeah.
you were thinking completely differently. And that kind of thinking differently is exactly what we need to solve the complex problems of today's society. So I actually am grateful for neurodiversity because I think that's where the solutions to these incredibly hard problems are going to come from. They're certainly not going to come from sort of, using the same plan over and over again.
Agreed. The world needs both, right? The world needs people like me and you who think differently and think out of the box. And I don't want my accountant to do that. I don't want an innovative way to do my taxes, right? Like the world needs both to make this function. So I agree completely. Monica, you're such an awesome person to talk to. I can't tell you how thankful I am. This was so helpful. Where can people find more about you, your work, and Unstuck and On Target?
Unstuckandontarget.com and unstuckandontarget.org is going to be our new website. So I look forward to seeing people there. Lots of information about Unstuck, ways to contact all of the authors. One of the beauties of Unstuck is that it's a multidisciplinary team. So we're thinking about the whole person, not an approach.
So cool. Could not recommend that curriculum more highly. Thank you again.
Take care.
Thank you for joining us on the Executive Function for All podcast. If today's episode brought you any value, please rate us 5 stars and share it with someone who may benefit. And remember, every small step you take builds towards your success. For resources and guidance, visit untappedlearning.com. Keep growing, keep learning, and we'll see you next time.